Are you allowed to use deadly force to prevent people from breaking in your door? Let's start with the assumption that they're bad guys, like here. The answer is yes, of course. So here's the relevant Seattle statute on this. And the law would be similar in other states. I'm trying to, let's see. So this is Seattle's, essentially it's self-defense statute, 9A 16050, homicide when justifiable. So a homicide is, and here we're talking about, well, a homicide is also justifiable when committed in the lawful defense of the slayer, that's you, the defender, or your husband, wife, child, brother, sister, or any other person in his presence or company when there's reasonable ground to apprehend a design on the part of the person you killed to commit a felony or do some great personal injury to the slayer or to any other such person, and there is imminent danger of such design being accomplished. So this is Seattle's deadly defensive force statute. Many states will have a self-defense statute, and paragraph 1 will be no non-deadly force. Paragraph 2 of that same statute will be deadly force. Other states, like Washington, distinguish between non-deadly and deadly in different statutes entirely. So they have a non-deadly force statute that only addresses non-deadly defensive force, and they have a deadly defensive force statute, which is what we're looking at here. So this first paragraph basically says you can use deadly defensive force to defend yourself against an imminent, unlawful deadly force attack. That's just straight up self-defense. Or another justification for homicide is in the actual resistance of an attempt to commit a felony upon your person or upon his dwelling or other place of abode in which he is. So do we have an attempt here to commit a felony upon the homeowner discharging the gun at the bad guys? Well, sure, because what's happening here? I didn't see I didn't see a explicit Washington state home invasion statute. Many states do have that, but it's okay because we have a burglary statute. Here's Washington state's burglary statute, very concise. Burglary in the first degree, the highest degree of burglary, a class A felony, the highest degree of felony. I guess except for a capital felony. And it reads, a person's guilty of burglary in the first degree if, with intent to commit a crime against a person or property therein, he or she enters or remains unlawfully in a building, and if in entering or while in the building or in immediate flight therefrom, the actor or another participated in the crime, is armed with a deadly weapon or assaults another person. So do we have this attempted entry into the home here? We sure do. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to kick in the door. Do they have guns? Here's the gun in this guy's hand, Mr. Gray Sweat Clothes. He's got a gun in his right hand. And then the fellow behind him who steps up, I believe we also see there's a gun in his hand there, his right hand also. And there's a gun in this guy's left hand, the guy in the black hooded jacket. So they're all armed with guns. So they'd all meet the definition of felony burglary, and a felony burglary, of course, on a dwelling, which is the second justification under Washington law for the use of deadly defensive force. So just as a blanket statement, the homeowner here is privileged to use deadly defensive force against these men. Now, it may get more complicated when we ask ourselves, well, at least initially, ultimately the door does get kicked open, right? Right there. The door gets kicked open by this dude. But there are shots fired by the homeowner before the door is kicked open. And those arguably are being fired without a direct visual line of sight to the bad guy. So he's not specifically aiming at individual bad guys when he's firing those shots. He's just kind of blasting through the door. Are you allowed to do that? Well, I'm not saying it's a good idea necessarily. But there's nothing in the law of self-defense that says you can't. The concern would be whether or not you're doing it recklessly. So do you only suspect there's someone on your front porch who may have bad intent? You hear a shuffling on the front porch and you fire a shot through your front door. Well, that's probably reckless because you wouldn't have a reason, the application of your powers of reason to actual facts that you're observing to believe that that mere shuffling sound on your front porch was somebody attempting to gain entry into your home. But is that all we have here? I mean, they don't want you shooting the FedEx guy dropping off a package, right? But of course, here we have much more. We have 2, 3 gentlemen taking turns kicking in their front door. You think they can hear that use of force on the front door inside the home? You think they can see the door shaking? You think it's at all ambiguous to them that someone's trying to breach their home? And those people are immediately on the other side of the door? Do you have to wait until the door is open? No, you don't have to wait. If you reasonably perceive that imminent felony entry into your home, you don't have to wait for the door to open. In fact, I would suggest that tactically, it gets pretty disadvantageous, because if 3 guys swarm into your house, get through the door, and then split up in different directions, you're done. You're not defending your home from 3 armed guys inside your home coming at you from different angles. So I think a solid argument can be made that you literally can't afford to wait for the door to be kicked in. Now, what about your neighbors across the street? Well, you know, they're innocent bystanders, right? What about the threats of your fired rounds to them? Well, of course, nobody wants to shoot their innocent bystander neighbors. That should go without saying. But first of all, we're presuming that there are neighbors across the street. I don't know if that's the case. Maybe it's just woods across the street, in which case you don't have that concern. What if there are neighbors across the street? Well, technically, the law says as long as your intent in firing rounds at a bad guy in a non-reckless manner was good intent, that a bullet may proceed downrange and strike and kill an innocent bystander, does not create legal liability for you, because your good intent transfers to that unintended victim. This is the inverse of how transferred intent, and transferred intent is a legal doctrine. My post-production guys hate it when I forget to change this. So that's the opposite, or the inverse, of how transferred intent typically works as a legal doctrine. Normally it works in the negative sense. So somebody decides they want to shoot me dead unlawfully, and they fire a murderous bullet at me, and it misses me, and it hits some innocent bystander down the road. That innocent bystander, the shooter, had no murderous intent towards them. So are they guilty of murdering that innocent bystander? The answer is yes. The murderous intent they had towards me transfers over to the unintended victim. That's the transferred intent. In that case, it's a bad intent. But the same doctrine applies in a good intent. So if you're shooting at someone in lawful self-defense and you're doing it non-recklessly, you're doing it in a responsible way, you know, bullets miss. I mean, they don't really miss. They keep going until they hit something, but they might miss their intended target. This happens something like 50% of rounds fired by police in self-defense scenarios. They miss their intended target. That bullet keeps going till it hits something. If it hits a person, it could well kill that person. But the good intent of firing the round in a non-reckless manner in lawful self-defense, that good intent carries over to the innocent bystander, is the legal argument you would make, your lawyer would make, for why you shouldn't have legal liability for that. That doesn't not make it a tragedy. Nobody wants an innocent person killed. But this is how the law allocates liability in a use of force law context. Well, another interesting question here is, what if the homeowner was not actually shooting that blindly? Right? So you can imagine if you had, you know, a front door with glass in it that you can see through, maybe you could actually directly target the bad guys with your firearm. But what if you don't have that? And this appears to be a solid door, you know, through which you can't see through. Well, maybe the homeowner's actually looking at his phone, which if you have like Ring cameras, and I assume the same is true of Google type cameras, you can just stream it right to your phone. So your phone becomes a screen in your hand showing you what the camera's seeing outside. So maybe the homeowner was not so blind. Maybe the homeowner was actually observing this and kind of, you know, in an indirect way, aiming his firearm. The only way we'd know that, of course, is from the homeowner. But that would be a way to kind of be aiming your gun in a virtual sense. By the way, folks, I would encourage people to have more than one camera. This camera appears to be like above the door, which is not a bad place for a camera. You can always have the doorbell camera. You can always have cameras from other angles. At my own house, I have a camera that's beyond the door that faces back towards the door, so that I can see the rear of whoever's at my door, as well as to the sides of the door, in case people might be hiding there. So something to keep in mind. One doorbell camera, I mean, they'll just put their thumb over it or a piece of tape over it, right, the moment they step up. But if you have cameras at different heights, especially if they're high enough not to be readily accessible, that can be useful information. Let's see, what else did I want to address? I had put some stuff in my own email here. Did I delete all my own emails? No, I couldn't have done that. Here we go. So, oh yeah. So what if these guys had been cops? Right? I mean, we know they're not. So what's the homeowner thinking here? Say the homeowner was not in real time observing his camera feed. So he has no visual of these bad guys. They shout Seattle police, they're kicking in his door. The homeowner is not required to make perfect decisions in self-defense. There are many cases in which the police are making an entry into a home. Maybe it's a wrong address home. And they break into the home and they're shot by the homeowner. And the homeowner has no legal liability for shooting at those police because he had a reasonable perception that they were unlawful intruders into his home. He did not know they were police acting in the course of their legal duties. And the question, of course, is whether or not your perception of those police as unlawful intruders into the home was a reasonable perception. It doesn't need to be correct. It just needs to be reasonable. The cops could have a warrant with your address on it. It was mistakenly written down by the court. So as far as the cops are concerned, they're acting lawfully. And you might still be privileged to shoot them if you perceive them as being reasonably unlawful intruders into your home. Of course, it's not your assessment of whether your perception was reasonable that controls your legal fate. It's the perception of other people. So you shoot at these police coming to your home and you say, hey, I reasonably perceive them not as police, but as unlawful intruders. Well, other people are going to make their own evaluations of how reasonable that was. And their evaluation, that of the police, that of the prosecutor, that of the judge, that of the jury, determines whether or not you'll face legal liability for the perception that you had. They'll decide whether they think it was reasonable for you to have that perception. And that's what controls your legal fate. So it becomes a very fact-sensitive issue, right? Where there are lots of like police cars outside the home with lights and sirens on. So any reasonable person would have perceived it was likely, even if a mistaken, it was a otherwise legitimate police action taking place. Are there like flashbangs being deployed? So they throw in a flashbang and then they're shouting police. So maybe you just can't hear anymore because of the flashbang. So you can't hear their screams of police. Maybe you're aware that criminals, not infrequently, when they're engaged in home invasion, will pretend to be police officers, as was noted in the tweet that first directed me to this video. Maybe if you want to make that claim that, hey, I'm aware that there's lots of cases where people falsely claim to be police to engage in a felony home invasion, maybe it would be good if you could document that you had that knowledge at the time you had to make the decision on how and whether to defend your home.